In 1984, 6 college students left for what was supposed to be a fun summer experience training for becoming camp counselors at Camp Packanack. A relaxing break from the stresses of the last semester and a chance to enjoy the beautiful outdoors. Led by the experienced owner Paul Holt, it was supposed to be like any other summer. Sandra Deere and Jeff Dunsbury were both found with puncture wounds 30 centimeters across, going straight through their stomachs. Scott Cheney, his throat slit open. Terry McCarthy, multiple severe blunt force trauma, rendering her brain a pile of mush. Mark Jarvis, a 12-inch cut across his face, 2 inches deep. Vicky Perry, disemboweled. Several of these bodies were found in a shack in the woods, along with the body of a local officer, Deputy Winslow, while others were spread across the campsite. When police arrived at the scene, they found Paul Holt wrestling a large disfigured man in one of the cabins. On the floor of this cabin washed an unconscious woman, Paul Holt's assistant, Ginny Field. Police quickly took both men into custody and Ginny to the hospital. It wasn't long before she and Paul pressed charges against the disfigured man, identified as Jason Voorhees, a boy long thought to have drowned tragically in the nearby Camp Crystal Lake. Voorhees displayed signs of selective mutism and repeatedly lashed out against both the guards and fellow inmates. Without any kind of funds to his name or the ability to speak to his case, a public defender was assigned to him.
Members of the jury, have any of you ever had a bad day and just wanted to be left alone? It's a feeling we can all relate to. Some of us want to be alone for a few hours, some maybe for a weekend, or even their entire lives. Who are we to judge another's life choices? Jason Voorhees, the defendant, is a simple and humble man who lived a peaceful life grazing off the wilderness for 27 years. All he ever asked from anyone was to respect his decision to live out on his own, and in all that time, no one has ever had a problem with him. Not once will you find anything on the record of any accusation or even rumors that my client hurt anyone, stole from anyone, or did anything other than keep to himself. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, we're expected to believe he randomly decided to brutally kill 8 people? I get it. You see all these pictures floating around of this large, burly man getting handcuffed. He looks intimidating. I was shocked myself when I saw all the photos the news outlets took. Poor Miss Field being wheeled away, Mr. Holt crying as he was being questioned by the police. You know which photos they don't show? The ones of my client suffering on the hospital bed, a machete brutally lodged right next to his shoulder. It went so deep it almost got to his heart. His collarbone split into 2. It required immediate emergency surgery, and I regret to inform you, he lost control over his left arm. His right forearm was cut wide open by what Miss Field admits was from her use of a chainsaw. We'll get back to that later. So, my client almost died. Now, what injuries did Miss Field and Mr. Holt suffer? Mr. Holt suffered the tragic, horrible fate of bruising and some minor blunt force trauma to his head. Miss Field herself got a large laceration across her leg, which, let's be honest, easily could have been caused by a loose nail. Now, isn't that interesting, how the supposed killer almost died and lost the use of his left arm, while his supposed victims endured what? The equivalent of a bad night at a bar? All this goes to show a simple fact, a fact that will become self-evident as we bring out the evidence. Jason Voorhees is nothing more than a victim of an attempt by Miss Field and Mr. Holt to cover up their tracks in the murder of 6 innocent young college students. The whole business itself was a front. What even is a camp counselor school? It's already been established that all 7 of the attendees were well-experienced camp counselors, including several who had worked with Mr. Holt previously. Why would they be the ones who need to go to this so-called school in the first place? What were a chainsaw and a machete doing on the campsite? They're training to become camp counselors. Camp counselors work with middle school students, sometimes high school students even. When has any camp counselor found the need to show their students how to use a chainsaw? The prosecution's case is nothing but the dirtiest lie, and by the end of this trial, all of you will see my client for the man he truly is. He's a man who loves the outdoors, a good man living on his own, not bothering anybody, until one tragic night when he was viciously assaulted. Criminal trespassing, the prosecution claims. With all due respect, what a load of BS. Have any of you ever heard of a little something called adverse possession? Let's take this back a moment to the beginning. And please do forgive me, I was never good at it, but we're gonna need to do some math here. Mr. Voorhees was born on June 13th, 1946. That same year, his mother, Pamela Voorhees, moved with her son to Camp Crystal Lake as part of a job opportunity to work as a cook there. Just a few years later, Elias Voorhees, her husband and my client's father, abandoned the family, leaving Pamela to care for her son alone. Now, we were all children at some point, and we understand how they are. We all know how they can be cruel, especially if someone they know is different. We have on record the sworn statements of various staff who worked on Camp Crystal Lake during this time confirming this. My client, while growing up at the camp with his disabilities, was routinely bullied and harassed and abused by his peers.
Objection. Relevancy. This has nothing to do with the claims of criminal trespassing.
I am simply trying to set the scene to show how and why my client chose to live the isolated life he lived.
Overruled. Continue.
Eventually, this abuse culminated in a terrible, terrible incident in which a group of his young tormentors threw him into Crystal Lake despite my poor client not knowing how to swim. The camp counselors weren't there to stop them or to save him. No adult was there. That was in 1957. After he survived, he went out, he found an old abandoned shack in the woods of the camp and made it his home. Can that truly be considered criminal trespassing? Does the mere fact he happened to live out on the campgrounds make it such? Well, according to New Jersey Statutes 2A 14-30, 30 years possession of real estate constitutes full and complete right and title in every actual possessor and shall be a good and sufficient bar to all claims that may be made or actions commenced on any person whatsoever for the recovery of any such real estate. Now, my client started living in his shack in 1957. That makes 27 years. However, he also lived in the camp from birth, since his mother moved there in 1946 as part of her job. That makes 38 years. That's well within the requirements of adverse possession. Now, that does come with a stipulation that the number of years is up to 60 if the lands being possessed are uncultivated or woodlands. Ladies and gentlemen, what are woodlands? Well, according to 25 CFR 163, a woodland means forest land not included within the timberland classification, stocked or capable of being stocked with tree species of such form and size to produce forest products that are generally marketable within the region for products other than lumber, pulpwood, or veneer. Can we pull up Exhibit C? Does that shack contain any trees in it? I'm no botanist, I admit, but that shack is devoid of any plant life, so calling it woodland seems like a stretch. Moving on, the prosecution is also claiming my client desecrated human remains, charged in the second degree. 1 second. Here we go. Title 2C, Section 2C, 22-1. A person commits a crime of the second degree if he 1. Unlawfully disturbs, moves, or conceals human remains. 2. Unlawfully desecrates, damages, or destroys human remains. My client has been accused of both 1 and 2. Now, we all know of the tragedy that happened 5 years ago at Camp Crystal Lake, as mysterious and unresolved as the whole event was. What is clear is that a great many people lost their lives, and one of those lives included my client's dear mother, Pamela Voorhees. Let's talk about Mr. Voorhees and his mother for a moment. As we talked about, Miss Pamela Voorhees single-handedly raised my client. His father wasn't in the picture, he took off. She worked far, far more than full-time trying to provide for him. But even so, she found the time to homeschool him, to give him the best accommodations she could for his disability. She was his only comfort in the vile harassment campaign by the other children at the camp. She was the only light in his life. Now, let me ask you, say your mother passed away. The only healthy relationship you ever had, the only comfort and love you ever had, died. Wouldn't you want to honor her? 5 years ago, my client had stumbled upon her dead body. Maybe he even witnessed her murder. He was heartbroken and terrified. All he wanted was some kind of closure. Pull up Exhibit B. Now, I do acknowledge this isn't the most conventional burial. He also didn't get a funeral director to file a death certificate. At the same time, I'm not 100% sure he knows what a funeral director is, or even what a funeral is. I mean, you have to remember, this man lived his entire life from age 11 on his own in the forest. How is he supposed to know the intricacies of various legislation on what you need to legally hold a funeral? It's a ridiculous expectation. One thing is clear, however, is that the photos you see here are nothing more than the equivalent of a private burial, which, by the way, he went to a lot of effort to set this up. I mean, look at that. He kept her head preserved, candles, which he made himself. Bottom line, he's her son, the last family she had. He had the right to move the body and hold a funeral. Now, onto the big stuff. What's been getting headlines everywhere. The disgusting accusations that hold no basis in reality whatsoever that my client murdered 6 camp counselors, an honored police officer, and a member of the local community. We're going to go piece by piece here. If we go through the account of Mr. Holt, Miss Field, and Mr. Bowen, by the way, just make sure we're still all on the same page. Mr. Holt being the owner of this camp counselor school, Miss Field is his assistant, and Mr. Bowen, one of the trainees. There were 2 days of various camp activities, which frankly aren't important to us. At the end of the second day, Mr. Holt invited everyone to go out drinking with him. Apparently, Mr. Bowen is the only one who accepted. Wow. He has 7 college students with him, and only 1 accepts an invitation to go out drinking? Back when I was in college, it'd be a miracle if 1 person declined. Mr. Bowen stays in town. Apparently he felt he was too drunk to drive back, but Mr. Holt and Miss Field decide to drive back to the cabins. When they do, they claim they found everyone dead and allege that my client attacked them. The prosecution further claims that Mr. Voorhees murdered all of the other trainees while they were at the bar. Let's put this in perspective. We have a man who has never had a proper education, suffers from hydrocephalus, and has had no experience practically with the outside world since he was 11, and suddenly deciding he should start randomly murdering people. Now, I acknowledge 3 bodies were found in my client's home, the same room as his deceased mother. Evidently, someone or some people moved them there. But I would call into question Mr. Voorhees' knowledge of general society, and this relates. Does he, for example, know what the police force is? I do feel obligated to point out that there have been attempts to question him on this, and those attempts have shown inconclusive results. Irrespective of the attempts made, this cannot be discounted considering his circumstances. If he doesn't know what the police are, I ask you, why would he need to hide any of the bodies? Hiding the bodies is only something someone would do, or some people would do, if they were afraid of the consequences. Not only that, but consider for a moment the choice of where the bodies were hidden. The 3 bodies were hidden in the same room as his own mother's funeral altar. I'll remind you, his mother meant the world to him. She was his only family. This would be like if one of your relatives died and you decide your relative should share a coffin with some stranger. It's not something anyone would do. It's complete disrespect to the dead. My client has had a lot he needed to overcome, but never has he ever suffered from a lack of respect for his late mother. I would like to get back to the fact there exists a certain discrepancy between Mr. Voorhees' past behavior and the murder streak he is alleged to have gone on. This discrepancy becomes far more apparent when considering the murder of Mr. Ralph Neely, a murder committed by being strangled with barbed wire. We have, on account, residents from the area about what kind of man Mr. Ralph Neely was. Some, and I quote, use words to describe him that aren't very flattering, such as senile or dementia. They talked about how he would wander around the forests of Crystal Lake and scare people by giving them these ominous warnings. Apparently he's been doing this for many years as well, decades actually. So, if he's been doing this at the same time my client's been living out here for so long, my client's clearly been well aware of his presence. Nothing in my client's past would have ever suggested any hostility towards him doing this for decades. Anyway, though, returning from that digress, Mr. Holt and Miss Bowen return and enter the main cabin. There, they claim they were ambushed by my client, who was hiding in the dark with a pitchfork. Man, he attacks them with a pitchfork. He attacks Mr. Neely with barbed wire. Miss Sandra Dreer and Mr. Jeff Dunsbury were killed with a spear, and Officer Winslow appears to have been killed with a hammer. For a guy who doesn't even know what deodorant is, he sure loves to switch around weapons a lot. It's almost as if there were multiple people who were each using different weapons. By the way, how does a 6'4" man who weighs 275 pounds while wielding a pitchfork just hide in the dark? It's not rocket science. The man can't teleport. If there was any light, they would have easily been able to spot him. Then Mr. Holt claims he grappled with him. In the scuffle, he is said to have been knocked unconscious. The fact that Mr. Holt received some blunt force trauma to his head is not under dispute. I would add, though, that my client has also suffered bruising and blunt force trauma. Clearly a fight did happen, but who attacked whom? Was it the simple woodsmen, who, I repeat, no record of any kind of violent behavior, or was it Mr. Holt? Mr. Holt, who, unlike Mr. Voorhees, has a criminal record, including an assault charge.
Objection. This charge is from decades ago. It has no relevance to this case.
Sustained.
After Mr. Holt's claim that he was knocked unconscious, my client is alleged to have chased after Miss Field to the bedroom of another cabin. According to Miss Field's testimony, she found a chainsaw in the closet. It's been many, many years since I have gone to any kind of camp like this, but I am more than willing to guess that all of us at some point have been to summer camp. Do any of you remember having a chainsaw in any closet bedroom? Having a chainsaw on site at all in the first place is a massive red flag. What campground activity are you going to need a chainsaw for? Even if we ignore that, and that's a big if, why is it in a closet bedroom? I would have expected there was some storage shed or shack where they would have kept that kind of equipment. There's only one reason she brought that chainsaw along. Mr. Holt and Miss Field and Mr. Bowen had bodies they needed to dispose of. Now the truth finally comes to light. Mr. Voorhees stumbled upon the gruesome sight that Mr. Holt and Miss Field left behind. 2 others found the same thing and lost their lives. Officer Winslow and Mr. Ralph Neely. Why else would they be killed? They saw what was happening. They tried to stop it. I don't know if these 2 lost their lives from Miss Field or Mr. Holt or Mr. Bowen, but what's obvious is that Mr. Voorhees wandered on the same path and found himself in the same life or death struggle. Returning to the prosecution's narrative, Miss Field admits to attacking my client with a chainsaw, slicing his forearm wide open. That slice required 22 stitches, according to the hospital records. It was brutal. Here, however, is where the story falls apart further. She decides to drop the chainsaw and hit my client over the head with a chair? Does she really expect us to believe this? Come on, we're all smarter than that. She claims she was terrified for her life. Even if she didn't want to kill him or hurt him more, she would have kept it for self-defense. Moving on. Then, instead of helping the unconscious Mr. Holt or getting in her car, driving off to safety and getting help, or even walking up to the main road, she flees into the woods and finds my client's house. Mr. Voorhees is said to have followed her there, and now he has a pickaxe. They just cannot keep their story straight on what kind of weapon he had. What would a pickaxe be doing at this campsite? At least with the chainsaw, as little sense as that made, I could at least understand they were in a forest and people cut wood in a forest. What are they going to do? Go coal mining together? And to suggest my client was the owner of the pickaxe is just as ridiculous. He doesn't have any money. He can't even speak. At my client's home, a struggle ensued. She claims Mr. Voorhees sliced her leg open with the pickaxe. 2 different doctors testified here in court that her injuries were not consistent with injuries inflicted by a pickaxe. Just thought I would make sure everyone here remembered. She, in turn, admits to lodging a machete deep into his shoulder, almost reaching his heart, which, if it did, would have killed him. Mr. Holt then showed up out of nowhere. Forgive my memory lapse, but wasn't he knocked unconscious? Did Mr. Holt did testify they woke up and found them, but no way do you just wander around in the woods and get lucky enough to find the shack. If he was following Jason the whole time, he would have been hurt or would have had the opportunity to intervene earlier. We have reached the end of Mr. Holt and Miss Field's account, and we have reached the biggest hole in their story. In the shack, they incapacitate my client, believing to have killed him. They make their way back to the cabin, still not trying to leave the campsite, I'll add. It is at this point they claim Mr. Voorhees ambushed them. Did I stutter when I said that he had a machete lodged into his shoulder, almost reaching his heart? Not to mention the large laceration across his forearm. He was bleeding all over the place as he was driven to the hospital. No man is capable of simultaneously bleeding to death and chasing down and attacking 2 people. He's lost all movements in one of his arms. He was in no condition to attack anyone. He'd be lucky if he wasn't dead. It's plainly impossible for him to have sustained those injuries while in the shack and also end up in a fight in the cabin. That is where I rest my case. This version of events the prosecution would have you believe is ridiculous, it's offensive, and we're all better than to believe this nonsense. Mr. Holt, Miss Field, and Mr. Bowen, none of them had any major injuries. At the same time, my client was brutalized, cut open, and almost killed. Whose account makes more sense?